Jackson Hayes wiped grease from his calloused hands as the Louisiana afternoon heat pressed against the open garage door of his workshop. The German shepherd in the shelter cage wasn't looking at anyone, hadn't moved in days according to the staff, but when Jackson whispered, "Shadow," a name that came from nowhere, the dog's head snapped up as though awakened from death itself. 3 weeks later, Jackson stood frozen in his own driveway, staring at the photograph someone had left on his windshield, his father in military uniform. Standing beside an identical German shepherd with a collar bearing the same serial number as Shadow's tag, a truth that made the blood in his veins run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The outskirts of Terrebonne Parish still hadn't fully recovered from Katrina, nearly 2 years after the storm had redrawn the landscape. Jackson Hayes's property sat on 3 acres of land that sloped gently toward a cypress grove, far enough from town that the silence was only broken by occasional passing trucks and the persistent cicada chorus. The converted barn he called home connected to a mechanic's workshop that smelled of motor oil, rust, and the coffee he brewed too strong each morning. At 42, Jackson's body carried the memory of 17 years as a firefighter, a career ended by the warehouse blaze that took his team and left him with a limp. Nightmares, and a medal of valor he kept in a drawer. His face, weathered beyond his years, rarely smiled anymore. Locals brought him their broken engines and left without small talk, respecting the invisible boundary he'd built around himself. The animal shelter on County Road 23 was a low concrete building that had once been a storage facility. The director, Michael Reynolds, ran it with cold efficiency, a former corporate manager who approached animal welfare like a business. Reynolds focused on numbers adoption rates, costs per animal, turnaround times. His pressed shirts and management buzzwords seemed out of place among the kennels. Dr. Amelia Wilson's veterinary practice operated out of a converted house on Main Street. A Louisiana native whose grandfather had trained military dogs in Vietnam. She had gentle hands and steel in her spine. She offered discounted services to rescue animals and veteran service dogs, making her beloved in the community but perpetually overworked. Marcus Thompson lived in a double-wide trailer surrounded by salvaged military equipment. At 60, the former canine handler still stood straight-backed despite 2 Purple Hearts and a titanium rod in his leg. His connections to military channels remained strong, though he rarely spoke of them. Local children believed his trailer contained secret government files, a rumor he never denied. Ray Washington, who mopped floors at the shelter, moved like a shadow between the kennels. His soft voice and downcast eyes made him nearly invisible to visitors. At 35, he carried himself like someone much older, his thin frame weighted by secrets he wouldn't share. He took special care with the kennels housing former service dogs, slipping them extra food when Reynolds wasn't looking, whispering to them in the language of soldiers. The flyer had been stuck under Jackson's windshield wiper at the hardware store. Bright yellow paper with bold black lettering, "Last Chance Military K-9 Adoption Day, Retired and Disqualified Service Dogs, Saturday, 10 a.m., 3 p.m. He would have crumpled it like the others, but something in the word disqualified caught his attention. Not retired, not honored disqualified. Like him. Jackson had no intention of adopting a dog. His life had no room for another heartbeat. Still, on Saturday morning, he found himself driving the 20 minutes to the county shelter, telling himself he was just going for the coffee and donuts these events usually offered. The parking lot was half full when he arrived. Families with children, couples holding hands, a few veterans in caps embroidered with unit insignias. Jackson kept to the edges of the crowd, hands in his pockets, nodding at the occasional familiar face but offering no conversation. Inside, The concrete-floored space echoed with barking. Most kennels held German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and the occasional Labrador dogs bred for service. Staff members in blue polos led potential adopters from cage to cage, explaining training backgrounds and health reports. A table near the entrance displayed water bowls, leashes, and pamphlets about integrating former military dogs into civilian homes. "These are highly trained animals," a shelter worker was explaining to a young couple, "but they need owners who understand their background. They're not typical pets." Jackson drifted past kennels where dogs pressed against bars, tails wagging, ears alert. Their eyes followed movement, hopeful for attention. Military discipline hadn't erased their desire for connection. Then, in the last row, Jackson noticed a kennel set slightly apart. Unlike the others, this one was quiet. The German Shepherd inside sat perfectly still, facing the back wall. It didn't bark, didn't pace, didn't seem to breathe. The tag on the kennel read, "Nash K9 435, not available for adoption." "That one's scheduled for disposal at 3, said a voice behind him. Ray Washington stood with a clipboard, eyes fixed on the motionless dog. Failed his reintegration assessment. Disposal. Jackson's voice felt rusty in his throat. Director's word, not mine. Ray said softly, "Dog won't respond to commands, won't eat regular. They say he's shut down completely. Too damaged to place." Jackson moved closer to the kennel. The shepherd's coat was dull, its frame powerful but lean to the point of neglect. Something about the animal's stillness struck him, not peace, but resignation. How long's he been like this? Since he came in 3 weeks ago, no prior history, no name, just a military ID number and orders to assess for civilian placement. Failed every test. Ray checked his watch. Director's doing final paperwork now. Jackson didn't know what made him kneel before the kennel. The concrete floor pressed painfully against his bad knee. The dog didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence. "What happened to you?" Jackson whispered. Nothing. Not even an ear twitch. Then, without thinking, Jackson said softly, "Shadow." The effect was electric. The dog's head snapped around, ears forward, eyes suddenly alive and fixed on Jackson's face. Not just looking, but seeing, recognizing. "Jesus," Ray breathed. "That's the first time he's moved for anyone." The dog's shadow rose slowly and approached the kennel door, movements stiff as though joints had forgotten how to work. He stopped inches from Jackson, amber eyes boring into him with an intensity that felt like recognition. "Is that his name?" Ray asked, confused. There was nothing in his paperwork about, "I don't know," Jackson admitted. "It just came to me." Michael Reynolds appeared, clipboard in hand, face set in its usual expression of corporate efficiency. "Washington, we need to prepare for the 3 o'clock procedure." He noticed Jackson. "Sir, this animal isn't part of the adoption program." "He responded to me," Jackson said, still looking at the dog. "Irrelevant. This K9 has failed multiple behavioral assessments. He's been deemed unsuitable for civilian placement." Reynolds checked his clipboard. "The procedure is scheduled and approved." "He has a name," Jackson said. "Shadow." Reynolds's eyes narrowed. "That name isn't in our records. This dog is simply K9 435, a failed unit." "He's not a unit," Jackson found himself saying. "He's a dog who recognized a name nobody knew he had." "Sir, we have protocols." "I'll take him." The words surprised Jackson as much as Reynolds. "Absolutely not." This animal is dangerous, unstable, based on what Jackson stood, ignoring the pain in his knee. He's been sitting here waiting to die, and the first time someone speaks to him like he matters, he responds. Reynolds's face hardened. Our assessment is final. Unless you're a certified K-9 handler with military clearance, I'll vouch for him. Ray's quiet voice cut through Reynolds' objection. I've been watching this dog for 3 weeks. This is the first sign of life he's shown. If Mr. Hayes is willing to take responsibility, I think we should reconsider. Reynolds glared at Ray, then at Jackson. The liability would be entirely yours. We officially recommend against this placement. If you still insist, there's additional paperwork, and you'll need to sign multiple waivers. Jackson looked back at Shadow, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't stopped staring at him. In the dog's eyes, Jackson recognized something he'd seen in his bathroom mirror every morning for years, the look of someone who'd witnessed things they couldn't speak of, who'd lost parts of themselves that wouldn't grow back. "Where do I sign?" Jackson asked. The drive back to Jackson's property was silent. Shadow sat unnaturally still in the passenger seat, his body rigid, eyes fixed on the road ahead. No panting, no curiosity about his surroundings. Just the mechanical presence of an animal who had forgotten how to be a dog. Not much of a talker either. "Huh," Jackson said, more to fill the silence than expecting a response. "That's all right. Neither am I." The paperwork had taken nearly an hour. Reynolds had produced waiver after waiver, each describing Shadow in clinical terms potentially dangerous, behaviorally unstable, unsuitable for civilian placement. Jackson signed them all without comment, feeling Reynolds' disapproving gaze. Only Ray had seemed supportive, slipping Jackson a bag of premium dog food and a worn leash when Reynolds wasn't looking. Sometimes they just need the right person. Ray had whispered, "Call me if you need anything." Jackson's property came into view, the weathered barn with its attached workshop, the gravel drive circling to the back, the cypress trees swaying in the afternoon breeze. He parked and turned to Shadow. "This is it. Not much, but it's quiet." Shadow made no move to exit the truck when Jackson opened the door. After a moment of consideration, Jackson said softly, "Shadow, come." The dog responded immediately, climbing down from the seat with deliberate movements. He followed Jackson to the door, maintaining a precise distance behind him, not the eager closeness of a pet, but the disciplined formation of a trained military animal. Inside, Jackson watched as Shadow surveyed the space. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a wood stove, a worn sofa, and a table covered in mail and coffee mugs. A narrow staircase led to the loft bedroom. Adjoining the main space was the workshop, visible through a wide doorway, tools hanging on pegboards and an old Chevy engine suspended from a chain hoist. "Make yourself at home," Jackson said, then added with a humorless laugh, "Whatever that means to you." Shadow remained standing, eyes scanning, body tense. Jackson filled a bowl with water and set it on the floor. "You drink when you're ready. I'm going to fix something to eat." While heating a can of soup on the stove, Jackson noticed Shadow hadn't moved. The dog stood like a sentinel, awaiting orders that wouldn't come. It was unsettling, watching an animal so still, so removed from its own needs. "Look," Jackson said finally, "I don't know what they did to you or what you're used to, but there are no rules here. No tests to pass or fail. You eat when you're hungry. Sleep when you're tired." Shadow's ears twitched, the first spontaneous movement Jackson had seen. After dinner, Jackson settled on the sofa with a book he'd been trying to finish for months. Shadow remained standing in the same spot, showing no signs of fatigue, "For God's sake, at least lie down," Jackson muttered. To his surprise, Shadow immediately sank to the floor, legs folded beneath him, still alert. "Not because I told you to," Jackson clarified. "Because you want to." Shadow's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Before going to bed, Jackson checked Shadow's collar standard military issue, weathered but sturdy. Attached to it was a small metal tag he hadn't noticed before. Not dog tags, but something smaller, stamped with an unfamiliar symbol and a serial number. Jackson turned it over in his fingers, frowning. The markings meant nothing to him, but the tag didn't look like standard military identification. "What's this about, boy?" he murmured. Shadow remained impassive, giving no clue. Jackson made a pallet on the floor with an old blanket. "You can sleep here if you want, or wherever. I'm not picky." Upstairs in the loft, Jackson lay awake, listening for movement below. Nothing. The house creaked with its usual night sounds, but Shadow made no noise at all. Jackson wondered if the dog would still be there in the morning, or if he'd somehow vanish as mysteriously as he'd appeared in Jackson's life. Around 2 a.m., a thunderstorm rolled in from the Gulf. The first crack of lightning illuminated the loft in harsh white. Jackson, already half awake from his usual nightmares, heard it then, a high, keening whine from downstairs, followed by the sound of movement, frantic and desperate. He found Shadow pacing tight circles in the kitchen, body trembling violently. The dog's eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing something beyond the walls of the barn. When lightning flashed again, Shadow flinched as though struck. Hey, Jackson said softly, dropping to his knees despite the pain it caused. "It's just a storm." Shadow continued pacing, trapped in whatever memory the thunder had triggered. Jackson recognized the behavior he'd seen it in men from his unit after particularly bad calls, had experienced it himself after the warehouse fire. The body remembering what the mind tried to forget. "Shadow," he said firmly. "You're here. You're safe." The dog stopped, head swinging toward Jackson's voice. His breathing came in short, sharp pants. "That's it. Focus on me. Whatever you're seeing, it's not happening now." Slowly, Shadow's eyes cleared. The shaking subsided. Though his muscles remained taut, Jackson stayed kneeling, giving the dog space but remaining present. Eventually, Shadow approached and sank down beside him, not touching but close enough that Jackson could feel the heat from his body. They stayed like that until morning, neither sleeping, both haunted by their private wars. At dawn, Jackson called Dr. Wilson's clinic and scheduled an appointment. The receptionist, hearing the situation, managed to fit them in that afternoon. The veterinary clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its wraparound porch equipped with benches for patients and their owners. Dr. Wilson met them at the door, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, laugh lines crinkling around her eyes when she smiled. "So this is the shelter dog," she said, kneeling to Shadow's level. She didn't reach for him, just observed. "He carries himself like military." "That's what they said at the shelter. He was scheduled for euthanasia when I found him." Dr. Wilson's smile faded. "Reynolds and his efficiency metrics. Come on back." In the exam room, Shadow allowed Dr. Wilson to check him over without resistance. His cooperation wasn't eager, merely resigned, as though his body weren't his own. "He's underweight," she noted, "and there's evidence of healed injuries. This scar along his flank, it's surgical, very precise. Is that normal for service dogs? Depends on their function." She ran her hands expertly along Shadow's spine. Some injuries get patched up in the field, but this wasn't emergency care. This was planned. She showed Jackson the small tag on Shadow's collar. This isn't standard. Military K-9s have specific identification. This is something else. Any idea what it means? No, but I know someone who might. She reached for her phone. Marcus Thompson worked with military dogs for 30 years. If anyone around here would recognize this, it's him. As she dialed, Jackson noticed Shadow's attention had fixed on something outside the window. Following his gaze, Jackson spotted a black pickup truck parked across the street, its engine running. The driver was watching the clinic. When Jackson looked back, Shadow's eyes were on him, alert, intent, trying to communicate something Jackson couldn't yet understand. "Dr. Wilson," Jackson interrupted quietly, "does your clinic have a back door?" They left the veterinary clinic through the service entrance, Shadow moving with newfound purpose. His body language transformed from passive resignation to alert vigilance. The black pickup was nowhere in sight as they circled back to Jackson's truck via the alley behind Main Street's row of businesses. "Probably nothing," Jackson muttered. Though he didn't believe it, Shadow's reaction had been too specific, too focused. Dr. Wilson had copied down the tag information and promised to contact Marcus. "Come by his place tomorrow afternoon," she'd said. "He doesn't answer his phone much these days, but he'll talk to me." That night, Shadow slept beside Jackson's bed rather than downstairs, not by command, but by choice. Jackson woke once to find the dog sitting upright, staring at the window, ears forward and body tense. He listened, but heard nothing unusual in the night sounds. Eventually, Shadow settled again, but his vigilance left Jackson uneasy. Morning brought heavy Louisiana humidity and the distant promise of another storm. Jackson worked in the shop, repairing Mrs. Thibodeau's ancient Ford pickup while Shadow watched from a corner. Occasionally, the dog's ears would swivel toward the door or window, tracking sounds Jackson couldn't detect. "You hear something out there?" Jackson asked during one such moment. Shadow's eyes met his, and Jackson had the unsettling feeling that the dog understood far more than an animal should. After a moment, Shadow rose and padded to the workshop door, standing alert beside it. Jackson wiped his hands on a rag and followed. Outside, the gravel drive was empty, the cypress trees still in the breathless afternoon. Nothing moved, but Shadow's focus remained fixed on the tree line at the property's edge. "What is it, boy?" Shadow gave a low whine, the first voluntary sound Jackson had heard from him. That afternoon, they drove to Marcus Thompson's place on the outskirts of town. The double-wide trailer sat on cinder blocks amid a collection of military surplus, a decommissioned Jeep, stacks of ammo crates repurposed as storage, and a flagpole flying both American and Marine Corps flags. A hand-painted sign at the gravel drive entrance read, "Trespassers will be used for target practice." Marcus himself sat on the trailer's small porch, a weathered man with close-cropped gray hair and the ramrod posture of someone who'd spent decades at attention. A cigarette dangled from his lips, and a service revolver lay disassembled on the table beside him for cleaning. "Amelia called," he said as Jackson approached. "Said you found yourself a military ghost." Jackson nodded toward Shadow. "This is him." Marcus studied Shadow without moving from his chair. His eyes narrowed, taking in the dog's stance, the way he positioned himself slightly ahead of Jackson, protective yet restrained. "That ain't no ordinary washout," Marcus said finally. "Come inside. Bring him." The trailer's interior was surprisingly neat, with military precision evident in the aligned furniture and systematically organized bookshelves. One wall displayed shadow boxes containing medals, patches, and photographs of younger men with dogs at their sides. Marcus gestured for Jackson to sit at a small kitchen table while he examined the tag from Shadow's collar. He turned it over in gnarled fingers, his expression darkening. "Where'd you say you got this dog?" "County shelter. He was scheduled for euthanasia." Marcus snorted. "Convenient disposal." He held the tag under a magnifying lamp. "This isn't regular military issue. This is from a program called Sentinel." "What kind of program?" "The kind that doesn't officially exist." Marcus returned to the table, lowering himself carefully into a chair, his right leg extended stiffly, the legacy of an old injury. After 9/11, there was a push to develop more sophisticated K-9 capabilities. Some programs went by the book, improved training protocols, better equipment. Others went elsewhere. Training methods that wouldn't pass ethical review. Conditioning techniques borrowed from places like Russia. Dogs pushed beyond normal limits. Marcus gestured toward Shadow. "Your boy here has the look, the stillness, the hypervigilance, the shutdown response to stress. I've seen it before in dogs that come out of black book programs." Shadow had positioned himself by the door, watching both men with unblinking attention. "What happened to these programs?" Jackson asked. "Officially disbanded after congressional oversight hearings in 2005. Unofficially—" Marcus shrugged. "The contractors took their methods private. Started selling to security firms, foreign militaries, anyone with cash and fewer scruples than Uncle Sam." He studied Shadow again. "This one's special, though. The way he carries himself. He wasn't just trained, he was exceptional. Top tier. The kind they don't discard lightly." "Then why was he at the shelter?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Marcus leaned forward. "Call him over here." Jackson hesitated. "Shadow, come." The dog approached smoothly, stopping at precise attention beside Jackson's chair. "Now give him a basic command. Anything." "Sit." Shadow sat immediately. "Form perfect. Now try something in a different language. German, maybe. If you know any commands." Jackson shook his head. "I don't." "Let me try," Marcus said. He issued a command in sharp German. Shadow didn't move. Marcus tried French, then a hand signal Jackson didn't recognize. Nothing. "Interesting," Marcus murmured. "He only responds to you. That shouldn't be possible with this level of training. These dogs are conditioned to respond to multiple handlers. Maybe because I used his name." "Name?" Marcus's eyes sharpened. "What name?" "Shadow. It just came to me at the shelter." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Dogs like this don't have names. They have designations, numbers. A name is a liability, creates attachment." He tapped the table thoughtfully. "Unless this wasn't his designation, unless someone named him secretly, against protocol." The implications hung in the air between them. If Shadow had been named in secret, someone had cared for him beyond military utility. Someone had recognized him as more than a weapon. "One more thing," Marcus said. "Did he show any unusual reactions, specific behaviors?" Jackson described the thunderstorm episode and Shadow's alertness to the black pickup. Marcus nodded grimly. "PTSD and target recognition. Classic signs of a dog that's seen combat. But there's something else." He glanced at Shadow. "These programs they experimented with enhancing natural canine abilities, scent detection, threat assessment. Some dogs developed skills that went beyond standard training." "What kind of skills?" "Depends on the dog and the program. Some could detect IEDs from impossible distances. Others could track targets for days without rest." Marcus rubbed his jaw. "You said he responded to a name you didn't know you knew. that he watches places before there's anything to see. Might be coincidence. Might be something more. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Shadow was on his feet instantly, a low growl building in his throat, the first aggressive sound Jackson had heard from him. Marcus reached for his service revolver, assembling it with practiced speed. "Not expecting company," he muttered. The door opened before either man could reach it. "Doctor—" Wilson stepped inside, her face flushed with exertion. "Your phone's off," she said to Marcus. "I've been trying to call." "What's happened?" "Someone broke into my office last night. They went through Shadow's file, took copies of his intake records from the shelter." She looked at Jackson. "Reynolds called a special town council meeting for tomorrow night. He's pushing for a dangerous animal ordinance specifically targeting former military dogs. He's using Shadow as the example." Marcus cursed under his breath. "Moving fast, aren't they?" "Who's moving fast?" Jackson asked. "Reynolds. Reynolds is just a pawn," Marcus said. "Someone's pulling strings. Someone who wants your dog. I found something else." Dr. Wilson continued. She pulled out her phone, showing them a photograph. "I asked a colleague at the VA about the Sentinel program. He sent me this. It's from 3 years ago, at a training facility in North Carolina." The photo showed a line of handlers with German Shepherds at attention. The image quality was poor, but Jackson could make out the distinctive markings on the last dog in line. "That's Shadow," he said. "Look at the handler." "Dr." Wilson urged. Jackson squinted at the blurry figure, a tall man with close-cropped hair. Face turned partially away from the camera. Something about the profile tugged at Jackson's memory, a half-formed recognition he couldn't place. "I don't know him." "Keep the photo," Dr. Wilson said. "Maybe it'll come to you." As they left Marcus's place, the old handler pressed a folded piece of paper into Jackson's hand. "Names and numbers," he explained quietly. "People who know about Sentinel. People who might help if things go sideways. Don't call unless you have to." The drive home was tense, the weight of unanswered questions filling the truck's cabin. Jackson glanced occasionally at Shadow, seeing him with new awareness. Not just a discarded military dog, but a valuable asset someone had tried to erase. But why? And why had he responded to Jackson when he'd shut down for everyone else? Rain began to fall as they turned onto Jackson's property, fat drops that promised a heavy storm. The gravel crunched beneath the truck's tires as they approached the barn. Jackson slowed, frowning. The workshop door stood ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it. Shadow growled softly. "Stay here," Jackson said, easing the truck to a stop. He reached under the seat for the tire iron he kept there. The workshop had been searched methodically, drawers pulled out, tools displaced. The cabinet where he kept records and receipts emptied onto the floor. Nothing seemed to be missing. This wasn't a robbery. It was a search. The living quarters were worse. Every cabinet opened, couch cushions slashed, the mattress in the loft upended. Even the pallet where Shadow had first slept was disturbed. When Jackson returned to the truck, rage simmering beneath his skin, Shadow hadn't moved. The dog watched him with knowing eyes. "Someone's been here," Jackson said unnecessarily, "looking for something." That night, after securing the property as best he could, Jackson sat at the kitchen table cleaning his old service revolver by lamplight. The power had gone out with the storm, casting the barn in shadows that danced with each lightning flash. Shadow lay beside him, alert despite the late hour. "What did you do, boy?" Jackson asked softly. "What did you see that someone once buried with you?" Shadow's ears twitched, but he gave no answer. The town council meeting was held in the community center, a converted church with wooden pews and poor ventilation. Despite the evening hour, the Louisiana heat pressed in, made worse by the crowd that filled every available seat. Word had spread about Reynolds's proposed ordinance, dividing the town between those who feared dangerous dogs and those who defended veterans' right to keep their service animals. Jackson sat in the back, Shadow lying at his feet. Dr. Wilson joined them, her professional presence a buffer against the occasional suspicious glance thrown their way. The meeting agenda covered routine matters: first road repairs, the upcoming summer festival, budget approvals for the volunteer fire department. Finally, Reynolds approached the podium, his pressed shirt and slicked hair incongruous with the casual dress of the council members. He carried a thick folder and spoke with rehearsed precision about community safety and liability concerns. Recent evidence suggests that military dogs with failed behavioral assessments pose a unique danger to civilian communities, Reynolds said, his voice carrying through the room. These animals are trained to attack, to view civilians as potential threats. When they fail their military certification, there's usually good reason. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reynolds continued, I've drafted an ordinance requiring special licensing for any home housing a former military working dog. Animals that have failed behavioral assessments would be prohibited entirely within town limits. And who determines what constitutes failure? Called a voice from the audience. Marcus Thompson stood, his military bearing commanding attention. These dogs serve our country. They suffer injuries, physical and mental, just like their human counterparts. Are we going to abandon them too? Applause broke out from veterans scattered throughout the crowd. Reynolds' expression tightened. This isn't about service, it's about safety. Case in point. He pointed toward the back of the room. Mr. Hayes recently adopted a K9 unit that failed every assessment. A dog deemed too unstable for placement. A dog with a history of aggression. All eyes turned to Jackson and Shadow. The dog remained perfectly still, showing none of the dangerous behavior Reynolds described. Jackson stood slowly. He wasn't a public speaker, had avoided crowds since his discharge. But the anger that had been building since discovering his home ransacked propelled him forward. That dog has a name, he said, his voice rough but carrying. Shadow. In the 4 days I've had him, he's shown no aggression, no instability. What he has shown is intelligence, loyalty, and the same kind of trauma I've seen in men who served. He gestured toward Shadow, who remained at perfect attention despite the crowd's focus. Look at him. Does he look dangerous to you, or does he look like a soldier who needs to come home? A council member leaned forward. Mr. Reynolds, what evidence do you have that this particular animal is dangerous? Reynolds opened his folder. K9435 was rejected by 3 separate placement programs. He failed to respond to handlers, refused food, and exhibited unpredictable behavior during assessment. May I, Dr. Wilson interrupted, approaching the podium. As the veterinarian who examined Shadow, I can tell you his physical condition suggests systematic mistreatment, not inherent aggression. The healing patterns indicate he was subjected to methods that would be considered inhumane by any standard. Reynolds scoffed. With all due respect, Doctor, you're a small-town veterinarian. These are military working dogs with specialized training requirements. And I'm a specialized trainer, Marcus called out, limping forward. 30 years with military K9 units. The dog isn't dangerous, he's recovering. Whoever wrote that assessment was either incompetent or lying. The meeting devolved into heated debate. Jackson remained standing, aware of Shadow's warmth against his leg, a solid presence amid the chaos of voices. Eventually, the council tabled the ordinance pending further review, a temporary victory that felt hollow given the unknown forces gathering around them. As people filed out after the meeting, Ray Washington approached Jackson, his movements cautious, eyes darting to ensure they weren't observed. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "Reynolds has backers, people with money and influence." "Why do they care about one dog?" Jackson asked. Ray glanced at Shadow, then back to Jackson. "Because he remembers something they need forgotten." "What does that mean?" "Not here." Ray pressed a folded newspaper into Jackson's hand. "Check the back page. Local obits from last year." Before Jackson could question him further, Ray melted into the departing crowd. At home, Jackson spread the newspaper on the kitchen table. The obituary section contained the usual notices: elderly residents, a few middle-aged victims of illness, a teenager lost to a car accident, nothing that connected to Shadow. Then he saw it. A small notice in the corner: James Harlow, 42, former military contractor, suicide. The accompanying photo showed a man with close-cropped hair and a rigid posture, the same man from the training facility photograph, Shadow's handler. The obituary mentioned military service, contract work with private security firms, and a distinguished career training specialized service dogs. A single line at the end noted he was survived by a son. Raymond. Ray Washington. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and rain began to fall again. Shadow moved to the window, watching the darkness beyond with the intensity of a sentinel. Jackson stared at the obituary, pieces falling into place. Ray Washington wasn't just a shelter worker. He was the son of Shadow's handler, a man who had apparently killed himself shortly after Shadow would have been removed from service. "What happened to you both?" Jackson whispered, looking from the photo to Shadow. "What did you see?" As if in answer, Shadow turned from the window and approached Jackson, for the first time since Jackson had brought him home. The dog initiated contact, pressing his head gently against Jackson's hand. The simple gesture broke something open in Jackson's chest, a wall he'd built after the warehouse fire. After watching men he'd considered brothers vanish in flame and smoke, he sank to his knees, arms circling Shadow's solid frame, face pressed into fur that smelled of rain and earth. "We're going to figure this out," he promised, voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Whatever they did to you, whoever's after you now, they'll have to go through me first." Shadow remained still in his embrace, but Jackson felt the slight tremor that ran through the dog's powerful body. Relief, perhaps, or recognition that he was no longer alone in whatever war he was fighting. Outside, a vehicle moved slowly past the property, headlights cutting through the rain before disappearing down the road. Neither man nor dog moved for a long time after it passed. The rain continued for 3 days, turning the parish roads to mud and washing out the bridge over Bayou Terrebonne. Jackson used the forced isolation to reinforce his property, installing new deadbolts, motion-activated floodlights, and clearing sightlines around the barn. Shadow remained his constant companion, his vigilance never wavering. On the morning of the 4th day, Jackson woke to Shadow's low growl. The dog stood beside the bed, ears forward, body tense. Jackson reached silently for his revolver as footsteps sounded on the gravel outside. A soft knock followed. Then Dr. Wilson's voice. "Jackson, it's Amelia." He exhaled, lowering the gun. Shadow remained alert until Jackson opened the door and the veterinarian stepped inside, rain dripping from her jacket. "Sorry to come unannounced," she said, "but I didn't want to call. I found something." She spread documents across the kitchen table, printed emails, medical records, training assessments, all bearing the Sentinel program header. Shadow approached, sniffing the papers, his posture changing subtly as he recognized something in the scent. "How did you get these?" Jackson asked. "Ray Washington. He's been collecting evidence since his father died." Dr. Wilson tapped a training record. Shadow, or K9 435 as they called him, was part of an elite unit trained for specialized detection work, not bombs or drugs, people. What kind of people? Specific targets. These dogs were conditioned to identify particular individuals under any circumstances, disguises. Crowds, environmental interference. They could track someone through a busy airport, through a sandstorm, even underwater. Jackson frowned. Military assassins, more like advanced reconnaissance. The dogs would identify high-value targets, track them discreetly, and guide extraction teams. She hesitated. But Shadow was different. According to these records, he developed an ability they hadn't trained for. What ability? He could identify people by more than scent or visual recognition. He somehow knew when a target was lying about their identity. Multiple field tests confirmed it. He would refuse to engage with a target using false credentials, even when the disguise fooled human operatives. Jackson looked at Shadow, who had settled near his feet, watchful as always. That doesn't explain why someone wants him eliminated. Dr. Wilson slid another document forward, a mission report marked classified. 18 months ago, Shadow and his handler James Harlow were deployed to Afghanistan for what was officially a routine security assignment. Unofficially, they were tasked with identifying a high-level intelligence officer believed to be selling information to hostile forces. She took a deep breath. The mission parameters authorized lethal force once positive identification was made. Shadow identified the target. But when the extraction team moved in, he blocked them, physically placed himself between the team and the target. He refused the order. According to Harlow's report, yes, the team proceeded anyway. The target was killed, along with 3 civilians who were later confirmed to be uninvolved. Dr. Wilson's voice softened. One was a child. Jackson felt something cold settle in his chest, and Shadow tried to stop it. Harlow's report states that Shadow's behavior indicated the target was using a civilian cover, but wasn't the actual intelligence officer. The dog was trying to prevent a mistake. She met Jackson's eyes. Harlow filed multiple protests up the chain of command. 3 weeks later, Shadow was removed from service, designated as failed equipment. 2 months after that, Harlow was found dead in his garage, carbon monoxide, ruled a suicide. But Ray doesn't believe it was suicide. No. He thinks his father was silenced because he wouldn't let the mission failure go, because he had evidence that the program executed the wrong person and covered it up. Jackson sat heavily in a kitchen chair, pieces clicking into place, and Shadow was living proof of that mistake. He knew the truth, and they couldn't allow that. Exactly. A dog that can detect deception is valuable until he detects the wrong deception. Shadow had moved to the window again, his posture alert. Jackson followed his gaze and saw nothing but rain-soaked trees. But Shadow's focus remained fixed, body tense with warning. "Someone's coming," Jackson said. "Rising, Doctor." Wilson gathered the documents quickly. "I should go. These need to be kept safe." "No." Jackson peered through the rain. "Shadow doesn't want you to leave." As if confirming his words, Shadow moved to block the door, his stance protective rather than threatening. "There's a storm cellar under the workshop," Jackson said, retrieving his revolver. "Trapdoor beneath the tool chest. Take the documents in Shadow. Stay there until I come for you." "Dr." Wilson started to protest, but a vehicle's headlights swept across the property, moving too fast for a casual visitor. Jackson ushered her toward the workshop, Shadow following closely. Once they were concealed, Jackson returned to the main room, positioning himself away from windows. The vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, pulled up to the barn, and two men emerged. They wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision, scanning the property methodically. Jackson recognized the approach: systematic, trained, dangerous. These weren't local law enforcement or casual thugs. They were professionals. He waited as one man approached the door while the other circled toward the back. The knock, when it came, was official, sounding 3 sharp raps. "Mr. Hayes," a voice called. "Federal agents, we need to speak with you about a military asset in your possession." Jackson didn't respond. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mr. Hayes, we have authorization to recover government property. Please open the door." Still, Jackson waited, watching the second man's shadow pass by a side window. The first man spoke into a radio, then tried the door handle. Finding it locked, he stepped back, considering. Jackson knew they would force entry soon. He needed to control when and how. He moved silently to the kitchen, activated a gas burner without lighting it, then retreated to the workshop entrance. When he heard the door splintering open, he struck a match and tossed it toward the stove. The explosion wasn't large, but it created enough smoke and confusion for Jackson to slip into the workshop unseen. He heard shouting, the sound of fire extinguishers being deployed. It wouldn't hold them long. Jackson was reaching for the tool chest concealing the cellar entrance when the workshop door burst open. The second agent stood silhouetted against the smoke from the kitchen, weapon raised. "Don't move," the man ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Jackson slowly raised his hands, revolver still gripped in one. Federal agents don't usually break into private property. "Where's the dog?" the man demanded, ignoring Jackson's comment. "What dog?" The agent stepped forward, face tight with irritation. "K9 435. Military property reported stolen from a secure facility. Where is it?" "There was no secure facility," Jackson replied. "Just a county shelter where they were going to kill him. The animal is government property. Mr. Hayes, valuable property. Its retrieval is a matter of national security." Jackson kept his expression neutral. If he's so valuable, why was he scheduled for destruction? The agent's eyes narrowed. "That's classified information. Now, I'll ask one more time." A low growl from behind cut him off. Shadow emerged from shadows the agent hadn't checked, his approach silent until he chose to be heard. The dog's posture was transformed, no longer the passive, traumatized animal Jackson had brought home, but a weapon precisely calibrated and targeting a specific threat. The agent's gun swung toward Shadow, but Jackson was already moving. He tackled the man as Shadow lunged, the three of them crashing into a workbench in a tangle of limbs. Tools clattered to the floor as Jackson grappled for the agent's weapon. The man was trained, strong, but Jackson fought with the desperate energy of someone protecting more than himself. Shadow circled, looking for an opening. Teeth bared in a silent snarl. The second agent appeared in the doorway, weapon raised. "Federal agent freeze." Neither Jackson nor the first agent complied, still struggling for control of the gun. Shadow shifted his attention to the new threat, positioning himself between the agent and Jackson. The standoff might have ended differently if not for the truck that skidded into the yard outside, its headlights illuminating the scene through the workshop windows. Marcus Thompson emerged, shotgun in hand, followed by two men Jackson recognized from the council meeting, fellow veterans. "Drop it, son," Marcus called to the second agent. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." The man hesitated, assessing odds that had shifted dramatically against him. His partner was still pinned beneath Jackson, their struggle at a stalemate. "You're interfering with a federal operation," the agent said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Funny thing," Marcus replied, advancing steadily. "I called some old contacts at the Pentagon. No federal operation authorized in Terrebonne Parish. No retrieval order for any K-9 unit. So either you boys went rogue, or you're not federal at all." Uncertainty flickered across the agent's face. His partner had gone still beneath Jackson, calculating. "Last chance," Marcus warned, the shotgun unwavering. "Drop it and identify yourselves truthfully, or I start making calls that will bring the actual federal government down on whoever you're working for." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the second agent slowly lowered his weapon. "We're contractors," he admitted. "Sentinel Recovery Team. We're authorized to retrieve program assets." "By who?" Marcus demanded. "Northfield Security Solutions. Private military contractor." Jackson maintained his grip on the first agent. "Shadow isn't an asset. He's a witness you were sent to silence." The man beneath him didn't deny it. Within an hour, the situation had transformed. Marcus's veteran friends secured the contractors while Dr. Wilson emerged from the cellar with the documents. Ray Washington arrived shortly after, bearing additional files that his father had hidden before his death. "This goes high up," Ray explained, pale but determined. "My father discovered that Sentinel wasn't just identifying targets, they were eliminating anyone who might expose contract violations, using their own dogs to select targets without proper intelligence verification." He looked at Shadow, who had stationed himself beside Jackson. Tension still evident in every line of his body. Shadow refused to participate. He recognized innocent people being framed as threats. The contractors were secured in Marcus's truck, their fate to be determined once proper authorities were involved. Jackson knew this was only the beginning. Northfield would send others when these men didn't report back. As they discussed next steps, a sharp crack split the air. Jackson felt something burn past his shoulder, followed by the unmistakable report of a high-powered rifle. Everyone dove for cover as a second shot shattered the workshop window. "Sniper!" Marcus yelled. "East tree line!" Shadow was already moving, a blur of purpose streaking toward the trees. Jackson shouted for him to stop, but the dog was beyond commands, driven by something deeper than training. "Cover me," Jackson told Marcus, then sprinted after Shadow, staying low, using outbuildings for concealment when possible. The rain had intensified, turning the ground treacherous. Jackson slipped twice as he pursued Shadow into the cypress grove. The dog had vanished among the trees, leaving Jackson disoriented in the gathering darkness. Another shot rang out, closer now, followed by a sound that froze Jackson's blood. Shadow's yelp of pain. Shadow. Jackson abandoned caution, crashing through underbrush toward the sound. He found the dog crouched behind a fallen log, blood darkening his rain-soaked fur. Despite the injury, Shadow's focus remained ahead, toward a shadowy figure retreating deeper into the trees. The sniper. Running now that his position was compromised, Jackson started to pursue, but Shadow whined, pressing against his leg. The message was clear. "Stay together. Stay safe." "You're hurt," Jackson said, examining the wound. The bullet had grazed Shadow's flank. Painful, but not life-threatening. "We need to get you back." Shadow resisted, still fixated on the direction the sniper had fled. Jackson understood this was Shadow's purpose, the work he had been trained for, identifying threats, protecting others. "Not alone," Jackson insisted. "We do this together, or not at all." Shadow looked at him, intelligence and determination evident in his gaze. Then, with painful dignity, he turned and led Jackson not in pursuit of the sniper, but in a wide circle back toward the barn, protecting his handler just as he had tried to protect civilians from a wrongful attack. They reached the barn as police vehicles arrived, summoned by Dr. Wilson. The local sheriff, skeptical at first, became increasingly grim as he reviewed the documents and heard Marcus's account of the confrontation. "This is beyond my jurisdiction," he admitted. "But I know people at the federal level who will take this seriously. Real federal agents, not contractors." As emergency services and law enforcement secured the scene, Dr. Wilson treated Shadow's wound. The dog lay stoically under her ministrations, eyes never leaving Jackson. "He saved your life," she said quietly. "That first shot would have hit you if he hadn't bumped your arm." Jackson nodded, throat tight. In the chaos, he hadn't realized Shadow had deliberately altered his position, sensing the threat before anyone else could. "He's been saving lives all along," Jackson replied. "That's why they wanted him gone." Later, as Shadow rested on a blanket near the wood stove, Jackson sat beside him, hand gently stroking the uninjured side of his body. The dog's eyes were alert despite the trauma, still watching, still protecting. "Rest," Jackson murmured. "It's my turn to stand guard." Shadow exhaled softly but didn't close his eyes. Instead, he shifted slightly, positioning his body against Jackson's leg, creating a warm, solid connection between them. Not quite surrender, but trust, perhaps the first real trust Shadow had given since whatever happened in that distant mission. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away blood and footprints, erasing traces of the night's violence. But it couldn't erase the truth those documents contained, or the bond that had formed between a broken man and a dog who had refused to be a weapon against the innocent. Jackson watched Shadow's breathing eventually deepen into sleep and made a silent promise to the animal who had found him against impossible odds. This wasn't over. Northfield would send others, more skilled, more determined. But they wouldn't find Shadow alone next time. They would find him protected by someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry the weight of lives saved and lost. Shadow's injury healed slowly. The bullet graze had torn through muscle, leaving an angry red line across his flank that Dr. Wilson treated daily with antibiotics and careful redressing. Despite her insistence that he rest, Shadow maintained his vigilance, sleeping only in short intervals, always positioning himself where he could monitor approaches to the barn. Jackson wasn't faring much better. The confrontation had left him with bruised ribs and a renewed hypervigilance that reminded him of his first months after the warehouse fire. He slept sitting upright, revolver within reach, listening for vehicles on the gravel road, for footsteps in the underbrush, for Shadow's warning growl that might signal another attack. 3 days after the shooting, Sheriff Guidry returned with news. The federal agents were indeed contractors working for Northfield Security Solutions, a private military company with government contracts and powerful connections. The sheriff's contacts in the FBI had confirmed that no official retrieval operation for military working dogs had been authorized in Louisiana. "They're running a black operation," the sheriff explained, seated at Jackson's kitchen table. "Trying to clean up evidence of whatever went wrong overseas." "What about the sniper?" Jackson asked. Guidry shook his head. "No trace. Professional. Could be long gone by now." But Jackson knew better. Professionals didn't abandon missions after one setback. Whoever had tried to kill him was waiting, watching, planning the next attempt. The knowledge hung over the property like the storm clouds that continued to gather on the horizon. A week after the shooting, Marcus Thompson arrived with supplies, extra ammunition, security cameras, and a warning. "My Pentagon contact says Northfield is scrambling," he said, helping Jackson mount a camera overlooking the driveway. Board meeting was called. Top executives flying in from overseas. Whatever Shadow knows, it's got them spooked enough to risk exposure. How much time do we have? Marcus checked the sight lines from the workshop windows. Days, maybe. They'll send a cleaner team next. No more pretending to be federal agents. Just elimination. Jackson glanced at Shadow, who lay near the door, ears forward despite his injury. We need to leave. Take Shadow and the evidence somewhere safe. There is no somewhere safe with these people, Marcus replied. They have resources, connections. You run. They'll track you. Standard protocol would be to let you think you've escaped, then hit you when you relax your guard. So we stay and fight against professional killers. Marcus considered this. Not exactly. We make a stand, but not here. We need to choose the battlefield. That night, Jackson asked Dr. Wilson to take the evidence files to her brother, a lawyer in New Orleans with contacts in the Justice Department. If anything happens to us, he needs to know where to send these. Jackson explained. She agreed reluctantly. What are you planning? Jackson. He couldn't meet her eyes. Something Marcus called drawing the snake from its hole. Doctor. Wilson touched his arm, her hand warm and steady. Don't sacrifice yourself. Or Shadow. There are other ways. Not with people like this, Jackson said softly. They don't stop. They just keep coming until they get what they want. And what do you want? She asked. The question caught him off guard. What did he want? For so long after the fire, he'd wanted nothing, just existence, day after numb day. Then Shadow had appeared, and suddenly he'd found himself wanting things again. Safety. Justice. A future where both of them could heal. I want Shadow to have a life, he answered finally. A real life, not just surviving. Dr. Wilson's eyes softened. And what about you? Jackson, don't you deserve the same? Before he could answer, Shadow rose suddenly, hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat. The dog moved to the window, body tense despite his injury. Jackson reached for his revolver, but Dr. Wilson caught his wrist. It's Ray, she said, nodding toward the familiar truck pulling up outside. Ray Washington entered with grim news. Reynolds is pushing the council again. Emergency session tomorrow to vote on the dangerous animal ordinance. He's got the votes this time. Why now? Jackson asked. Pressure from above. Reynolds got a call from Northfield's local attorney. They're claiming Shadow is their property. Stolen military equipment. They've filed an emergency petition for his immediate surrender. On what grounds? National security. They're saying Shadow was trained with classified protocols that can't be allowed to remain in civilian hands. Jackson felt cold anger spreading through his chest. They're using the law to finish what their contractors couldn't. The hearing's at noon tomorrow. Ray continued. If the council approves the ordinance and the property claim, they'll have legal authority to seize Shadow. Local police will be obligated to assist. Dr. Wilson shook her head. Sheriff Guidry knows what's happening. He wouldn't enforce it. Guidry's been called to Baton Rouge for a mandatory training session. Ray said, convenient timing. His deputy will be in charge, Reynolds's brother-in-law. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Use the legal system to isolate Shadow, then eliminate both dog and evidence under the cover of official action. No need for midnight raids or snipers when the law itself could be weaponized. Jackson looked at Shadow, who had returned to his position by the door after determining Ray wasn't a threat. The dog's eyes met his, calm and steady despite the danger gathering around them. We need to leave tonight, Jackson decided, before they can serve any papers. Marcus had already prepared for this possibility. A cabin deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, accessible only by boat, stocked with supplies and untraceable, Jackson and Shadow would go there while Marcus, Ray, and Dr. Wilson worked to expose Northfield through legal channels, as Jackson packed essential supplies. Shadow watched from the doorway, his posture betraying none of the pain his injury must be causing. "Just temporary," Jackson told him, though he wasn't sure Shadow understood. "Until we figure this out." But when he turned to grab his first aid kit, he found Shadow had disappeared from the doorway. Alarmed, Jackson searched the barn, then the workshop, before spotting the dog through the window. Shadow stood in the yard, body rigid, staring toward the cypress grove. Jackson followed his gaze but saw nothing in the fading light. Yet Shadow remained focused, a low whine building in his throat. Not aggression, but distress. "What is it, boy?" Jackson moved closer, scanning the tree line. "What do you see?" Shadow looked at him briefly, then back to the trees with such intensity that Jackson felt a chill despite the humid evening. Something was out there. Something only Shadow could detect. Dr. Wilson joined him at the window. "What's wrong?" "I don't know. He's sensing something." She studied Shadow's posture. "That's not his threat response. It's different, almost like—" Before she could finish, headlights appeared on the gravel road, not approaching the barn, but parked at the property's edge, pointed toward the cypress grove. In the harsh white light, a figure became visible among the trees, a man walking with his hands raised, approaching slowly. Shadow's whine intensified. Jackson grabbed his revolver and headed for the door. "Stay inside," he told Dr. Wilson. "If this goes bad, take Shadow and run for Marcus's truck." Outside, the humid air pressed against him as he advanced cautiously, keeping Shadow behind him despite the dog's attempts to move ahead. The approaching figure was tall, lean, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with military bearing. "That's far enough," Jackson called when the man was 30 yards away. "Hands where I can see them." The man stopped. "I'm unarmed," he called back. "I need to speak with you about the dog." "Who are you?" "My name is Daniel Harlow. James Harlow was my brother." Jackson kept his weapon raised. "Ray never mentioned an uncle. Ray doesn't know about me. My work kept me compartmentalized from the family." The man took another cautious step forward. "I was Shadow's first handler, before James. I've been tracking him since he disappeared from the shelter." Shadow had gone completely still beside Jackson, neither advancing nor retreating. His focus remained fixed on the stranger, body trembling slightly. "If you're who you say you are, why come now?" Jackson demanded. "Why not when your brother died?" Pain flashed across Daniel's face. "Because I was complicit in what happened to him, in what almost happened to Shadow. I'm here to make it right. But we don't have much time." He glanced at the road beyond Jackson's property. "They're coming tonight. A 4-man team. They have orders to eliminate both Shadow and anyone sheltering him." "Why should I believe you?" Daniel's gaze shifted to Shadow. "Because he knows me, and because I'm the reason he recognized the name you gave him." Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What are you talking about?" His designation was never K9 to 435. That was his cover for the Sentinel program. Daniel's voice softened. "His real call sign, the one we used in the field, was Shadow." Jackson kept his revolver trained on Daniel Harlow as they moved back toward the barn. Shadow walked between them, his posture alert but not aggressive, a silent witness to a reunion no one had anticipated. Inside, Ray Washington's face drained of color when introduced to his uncle. "My father never mentioned a brother in the program," he said, voice tight with suspicion. "Your father was protecting you. Daniel replied. We operated under strict compartmentalization. Family connections were security risks. Dr. Wilson studied Daniel with clinical precision. The resemblance is there, around the eyes. Daniel placed a weathered notebook on the kitchen table. James kept records, dates, locations, target assessments. After the Afghanistan incident, he began documenting irregularities in the Sentinel program missions where the intelligence didn't match Shadow's responses, targets eliminated despite inconsistencies. Jackson's hand remained near his weapon. If you were part of this program, why should we trust you now? Because I'm the one who smuggled Shadow out after they ordered his termination. Daniel's eyes held steady. I falsified the euthanasia records, arranged his transfer to a shelter outside normal channels. It was the only way to keep him alive while James gathered evidence. Then James died, Ray said flatly. Daniel nodded, pain evident in the gesture. I was overseas when it happened. By the time I returned, the investigation was closed, ruled a suicide. Shadow had vanished from the shelter transfer system. He looked at Jackson. Until you found him. Shadow had positioned himself beside Jackson's chair, body angled toward Daniel, not threatening, but watchful. The dog's behavior confirmed at least part of Daniel's story. He clearly recognized the man, though his reaction was measured, cautious. How did you find us? Jackson asked. I've been tracking Northfield's operations since James died. When their security teams deployed to Louisiana, I followed. Daniel gestured toward Shadow. I've been watching the property for 3 days. I needed to be certain it was him, and that I could approach without triggering his defensive protocols. Why come forward now? Because Northfield is escalating beyond what I anticipated. The team they're sending tonight isn't just contractors, they're former special forces, extraction specialists. They'll eliminate witnesses, secure Shadow, and make it look like a local dispute turned violent. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. You said Shadow recognized his name when Jackson used it. How is that possible? Daniel's gaze shifted to Jackson. That's what I can't explain. Shadow was never deployed under his call sign in any operation you would have been part of. The only ones who knew it were myself, James, and our direct commander. Jackson shook his head. I never met your brother. Never worked with military dogs. You were a firefighter, correct? 17 years with Terrebonne Parish Fire Department. Daniel's expression changed subtly. Were you part of the response team for the chemical fire at the Gulf Stream Research Facility in 2018? The question hit Jackson like a physical blow. The warehouse fire, the one that had claimed his team, ended his career, haunted his dreams. How did you know about that? Because James was there, undercover security evaluation. He had Shadow with him, off the official record. The room went silent. Jackson felt his pulse pounding in his ears as forgotten images surged to the surface, smoke so thick it turned day to night, heat that melted the reflective strips on turnout gear, voices on the radio growing increasingly desperate as the structure began to collapse. I never saw him, Jackson said finally. The smoke was too dense. We couldn't see 3 feet ahead. You wouldn't have seen them, Daniel agreed. But Shadow would have scented you through the smoke, would have logged your identity in his recognition patterns. It's what he was trained to do, remember people by more than visual identification. Dr. Wilson looked between them. Are you saying Shadow remembered Jackson from the fire? After all this time, these dogs don't forget, Daniel said. Especially not someone who... He hesitated. Someone who what? Jackson demanded. Daniel met his eyes directly. Someone who saved their handler's life. The memories hit harder now, disjointed flashes of that day. The section of roof that collapsed. The firefighter pinned beneath a support beam. Jackson had dragged him to safety seconds before the rest of the ceiling gave way. He'd never seen the man's face clearly through the smoke. Had been told later the victim was a security consultant who'd been trapped during an inspection. "That was your brother James." Daniel nodded. "He never knew who pulled him out. Was unconscious when the medical team evacuated him, but Shadow would have seen everything. Would have logged your scent, your voice pattern. So when I called him Shadow at the shelter, he recognized someone connected to his handler, someone his training identified as an ally." Daniel looked at the German shepherd with something like reverence. "These bonds, they're not just training. They're deeper than we understood when we started the program." Ray, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally spoke. "My father never talked about the fire. I knew he was injured on assignment, but he didn't share details." "He couldn't," Daniel replied. "The facility housed classified research. The chemical fire itself was classified, reported publicly as a standard industrial accident." Jackson felt Shadow press against his leg, a warm, solid presence anchoring him as the past rearranged itself around this new information. The dog had recognized him not by chance, not by some mysterious connection, but because they had met before in smoke and flame and danger. Shadow had witnessed an act of rescue and carried that memory through years of trauma, military service, and abandonment. "This changes nothing about our current situation," Marcus interrupted, practical as always. "Northfield's team is still coming. We need to move now if we're going to reach the basin cabin before dark." Daniel shook his head. "They'll have the roads watched, satellite tracking on vehicles registered to this property or known associates." He turned to Jackson. "There's another option, one James prepared before he died." From inside his jacket, Daniel withdrew a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed with age. "My brother left this with his attorney, to be opened only if something happened to him and Shadow both. When I returned from overseas and found James dead and Shadow missing, I retrieved it." Ray took the envelope with trembling hands. His father's handwriting marked the front, "In the event of my death and Shadow's disappearance." Inside was a deed to property in the Atchafalaya Basin, 20 acres of swampland accessible only by boat, with a small cabin built on stilts above the water. Along with the deed were access instructions, supply cache locations, and a letter addressed to whoever found Shadow. Ray read the letter aloud, his voice catching on his father's words. "If you're reading this, I've failed to protect Shadow from those who want him silenced. He is more than a military asset. He is proof of their crimes, witness to executions of innocent people under the guise of national security. The property enclosed is registered under a shell corporation that cannot be traced to me or the program. It is the only place Shadow can be truly safe while the evidence is compiled." The letter continued with operational details, emergency protocols, and finally, a personal note. "To whoever has found Shadow, he chose you. These dogs see what we cannot, sense truth beyond our understanding. If he trusts you, honor that trust. He is the best of what we tried to create, and the living rebuke to how we failed." Silence filled the room after Ray finished reading. Outside, the day was fading, shadows lengthening across the yard as the sun sank toward the cypress trees. "How quickly can we reach this property?" Jackson asked. 3 hours by boat, navigating by night." Daniel answered. "I have a skiff hidden downriver." Marcus studied the property map included with the deed. "Defensible position, limited access points. If they do track you there, you'll see them coming." Dr. Wilson was already gathering medical supplies. "Shadow's wound needs to be kept dry. I'll prepare a waterproof dressing." As they prepared for departure, Jackson pulled Daniel aside. "One thing doesn't add up. Why would Shadow respond to me using his call sign? He must have heard it thousands of times from his handlers. Daniel's expression grew distant. After the Afghanistan incident, Shadow shut down, wouldn't respond to commands, wouldn't acknowledge his call sign from anyone in the program. The psychologist called it selective disengagement, a trained response to conflicting loyalties. Meaning he chose to stop being a weapon, chose to stop responding to those who had betrayed his trust. Daniel looked toward Shadow, who was allowing Dr. Wilson to change his bandages. When you called him Shadow, it wasn't just that he recognized you from the fire. It was that you weren't part of the program. You represented something outside the system that had betrayed him. The explanation settled over Jackson like the weight of responsibility. Shadow hadn't just recognized him, he had chosen him as salvation, as escape from a life that had warped his nature and then discarded him when he refused to comply. Within an hour, they had loaded essential supplies into Marcus's truck. The plan was for Marcus to drive them to the boat launch, creating an obvious trail that Northfield's team would follow, while Daniel led Jackson and Shadow through the swamp to James Harlow's hidden property. Ray and Dr. Wilson would take the evidence to New Orleans, contacting federal authorities untainted by Northfield's influence. As dusk settled over the property, Jackson took a final look at the barn that had been his sanctuary and prison these past years. Like Shadow, he had retreated here after trauma, shutting down, withdrawing from connection, and like Shadow, he was now being called back into the world by forces beyond his control. "Ready?" Daniel asked, checking his watch. Jackson nodded, feeling Shadow press against his leg, steady, alert, connected. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Two survivors bound by a moment in smoke and flame, neither had truly forgotten. They moved into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the fragile safety of walls and locks for the uncertain protection of distance and water. In the east, stars were appearing one by one, navigation points in a sky that offered no promises, only possibility. 3 months later, Jackson sat on the porch of a small house on the outskirts of Lafayette, watching Shadow track the movement of birds across the autumn sky. The German shepherd's coat had regained its luster, his frame filling out with proper nutrition and decreased stress. The wound on his flank had healed to a thin white line, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. In the distance, a car approached along the gravel road. Shadow's ears perked, but his posture remained relaxed, recognition rather than alert. Dr. Wilson's sedan pulled into the driveway, and she emerged with a folder tucked under her arm, her smile visible even from the porch. "Good news," she called as she climbed the steps. "Your latest scan is clear. No residual tissue damage." Jackson nodded, touching his chest where the surgical scar was still tender. "The early-stage lung cancer." Shadow had detected the real reason the dog had responded so intensely to him at the shelter had been removed 6 weeks ago. A small tumor, caught before it could spread, discovered because a dog trained to detect threats had recognized the most intimate enemy of all. "Ray called this morning," Dr. Wilson continued, settling into the chair beside him. "The Congressional Oversight Committee has scheduled hearings for next month. Northfield's CEO has already resigned, and 3 former program directors have been indicted." Shadow moved to sit between them, his head coming to rest on Jackson's knee, a gesture of connection that had become routine during Jackson's recovery. Jackson scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had become essential. "And Reynolds?" he asked. "Resigned from the shelter, left town, according to Marcus." She smiled. "The new director is implementing a special program for rehabilitating former service dogs. No more disposal protocols." The justice that had seemed impossible during those rain-soaked days in the basin was unfolding slowly but inexorably. Daniel Harlow's testimony, combined with James's meticulous records and the evidence Ray had preserved, had created a case too significant to bury. Shadow, the living proof of the program's ethical failures, was now protected by federal whistleblower protocols. His status changed from military asset to key witness. "What about the cabin?" Jackson asked. They had spent 6 weeks in James Harlow's hidden sanctuary, long enough for federal marshals to secure indictments and ensure their safety. "Ray's keeping it. Says it might be useful for other veterans who need to disappear for a while." She reached over to stroke Shadow's back. "He's thinking of starting a rehabilitation program for former handlers and their dogs. Healing together." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only with the rustle of leaves and Shadow's contented sighs. The house purchased with a portion of the settlement from Northfield was nothing spectacular, but it was theirs. A place to heal, to rebuild, to begin again. "Marcus is stopping by later," Jackson said eventually. "Bringing those training manuals he mentioned. Dr. Wilson." Amelia, as she'd become in the quiet evenings during his recovery, nodded. "You're really going through with the therapy dog certification?" "Seems right." Jackson looked down at Shadow. "He saved me. Might as well let him save a few more." The plan had taken shape during his hospital stay, training Shadow as a therapy dog for veterans with PTSD, using his extraordinary sensitivity and calm presence to help others navigate the landscape of trauma they both understood too well. Not erasing his military background, but transforming it into something healing rather than harmful. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of his name, eyes meeting Jackson's with that same intelligence, that same quiet devotion that had sparked their connection in the shelter. No longer the broken soldier, no longer the discarded weapon, just a dog who had found his person and a man who had found his purpose. As the afternoon light gilded the porch in amber, Jackson felt the warm weight of Shadow against his leg and the gentle pressure of Amelia's hand on his arm, connections that anchored him to the present, to possibilities he couldn't have imagined in the solitude of his barn. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes it comes with 4 paws and knowing eyes, recognizing in us something we've forgotten about ourselves, the capacity to heal, to trust, to begin again. Friends, sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive when we're at our lowest, like Jackson Hayes. Many of us know what it means to be sidelined by tragedy, to withdraw from a world that seems to have no place for us anymore. We've felt that silence in empty rooms, that hesitation to form new connections, fearing what we might lose again. But Shadow's story reminds us that healing rarely comes on our own terms. It arrives unexpectedly, perhaps in the eyes of a shelter dog others had given up on, or in the kindness of neighbors who refuse to let us face our battles alone. After decades of life, we know that true courage isn't about standing unbroken, it's about reaching out when we're most wounded, recognizing our need for others. Jackson found healing not by escaping his pain, but by sharing it with a companion who understood without words. Their bond reminds us that it's never too late for a new chapter. Never too late to transform our deepest wounds into wisdom that helps others. The scars we carry, whether from loss, illness, or heartbreak, need not define us. They can become the very bridges that connect us to a life richer than we ever imagined possible. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.